Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And as I look at the attendees bar on Zoom, it's so nice to see it filling up with so many names, and including some familiar ones. It's great to have all of you with us this afternoon for this discussion on Germany's colonial past. We are delighted to have with us today one of the most renowned memory scholars, Professor Jonathan Bach from the New School. And the discussion will be moderated by my colleague, AICGS Senior Fellow, Dr. Eric Langenbacher, who is the director of our program on society, culture, and politics. We are also really pleased to to have the support of the German Embassy in Washington, D.C., for this series of events that we are commencing today. And I'm really pleased to hand the floor to the Minister for Communications and Culture, Arvid Enders, who will say a few words and then hand off to Eric Langenbacher to get us started. So Arvid, welcome, glad to have you with us today. Thanks for your partnership, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you very much to all of AICGS. We appreciate your work. We are very happy to partner also in this series. We think it's that you have made a very interesting choice of subjects, and also what we're speaking about today is, I think, extremely relevant. It's an issue that does not only touch on German history, but it's something that concerns a number of European nations, and actually quite a bit larger number than many people think. And I think we all, not only Germany, but Germany, and this is what we're talking about today, we have a responsibility still from our past and what our nations have done in other countries. And I'm thrilled that Jonathan Bach is here today, and I'm looking forward to your insights and also the discussion. I'm quite sure we will touch a wide range of issues, and I'm very happy to be part of it. Thank you, all of you, for joining, and thank you very much, especially to Eric Langenbacher and Jonathan Bach. I pass the floor on to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Before I introduce Professor Bach, I want to talk a little bit about this speaker series that we're doing here at AICGS. Last fall, we did a series devoted to the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall. And this year, we're continuing the series devoted to the 30th anniversary of German reunification. But we're also trying to take this as an opportunity to reflect on a variety of subjects and policy areas that we don't always have a chance to reflect on. So today, we're going to be talking about Germany's colonial pasts, especially over the last years. We will have upcoming events on things like Saxony, Saxon political culture, and how that ties into support for the AfD. We have had to reschedule several events because of the shutdown, but we will have an event on the evolution of LGBTQ rights and German environmentalism over the last 30 years. So please stay tuned for these events coming up in the future, and hopefully we can meet in person again as soon as possible. But today it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Bach, who's a professor of global studies at the New School in New York. Among many amazing publications, I do want to highlight one of the better books that I've ever read on German memory politics, called What Remains: Everyday Encounters with the Socialist Past in Germany. And then more recently, he's done a lot of work on urbanism. So for instance, he has a book called Recentering the City: Global Mutations of Socialist Modernity. But without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Professor Bach. Once he has finished speaking, we will have a moderated Q&A session. So you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen an opportunity to pose a question. I will then choose questions and then pose them to Professor Bach afterwards. All right, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Jeff and Liz and AICGS and Arvid Enders at the German Embassy for all your support and your invitation. So 30 years ago, as we all know, when the Berlin Wall fell, it triggered a new era in memory politics in which Germany solidified its reputation as an acknowledged leader of reckoning with the past. The motto of the German Foundation for dealing with the East German dictatorship is Erinnerung als Auftrag, remembrance as duty. And in a way, that could be a motto for the nation as a whole. Legitimate criticisms notwithstanding, Germany is looked to as a model for questions of reparations, compensation, apology, and commemoration stemming from the Holocaust. And the United German government has certainly tried to take seriously its second chance, so to speak, at coming to terms with the past with the SED regime. The established status of this memory order, however, 30 years after unification, appears to be coming under duress in a rapidly changing geopolitical and moral context, as part of a much larger reckoning with the colonial past taking place across the global north. As Arvid Enders mentioned just before, we see, for example, many other European countries that are involved in confronting their colonial pasts. We see them facing demands for the return of artifacts and human remains, new debates on reparations for slavery in the United States, for example, right here, and an increasing role that Japanese imperial slavery is playing in their difficult relations with South Korea. So the global north is experiencing a kind of post-imperial moment in dealing with the colonial past. And within Germany, recent years have seen a newly visible public layer of colonial reckoning as part of the official memory landscape. So for example, the 2018 coalition agreement explicitly added the phrase working through colonial history as part of the government's official duty. And it listed the memory of colonial history along with National Socialism and the SED regime as part of what was called in the coalition agreement, the fundamental democratic consensus, demokratischer Grundkonsens. This new and emerging landscape of colonial memory is challenging Germany's politics of remembrance by raising anew difficult questions about what it means for the state and for citizens to act responsibly in the face of historical wrongs and their lasting consequences. What does it mean, for example, for colonial era questions to acquire the status of a new phase of coming to terms with the past, alongside and sometimes in tension with, as we've been seeing in the recent debate around the Cameroonian scholar Achille Mbembe, the debates over the memory of the National Socialist or the East German past. Given deep disagreements over what responsibility for the past means in practice, these questions also raise the stakes for the future of Germany's global reputation as the leading normative example of how a democratic state should deal with difficult pasts. So, in this talk, I would like to analyze the landscape in which colonial era questions are arguably introducing a new phase of coming to terms with the past in Germany. I would like to first sketch out some of the reasons why the colonial past has become an increasingly central part of the memory landscape since 1990. And then I'd like to turn to a recent debate in the Bundestag that exemplifies how the contours of colonial memory are being configured in the context of contemporary politics. So let's start by looking at changes since 1990. During the Cold War leading up to 1990, discussions about the colonial past did not occupy a central place in the memory culture, though it would be wrong to say that it was absent. In fact, the colonial past was often invoked during the Cold War in popular culture and in politics, sometimes, especially early on in the early post-Cold War, in an early post-war era, in an exculpatory vein that implied a kind of nostalgia about benign rule, sometimes in the service of East German ideological positioning vis-a-vis the West, and very often in the context of the 1968 generation's protests against US imperialism and the war in Vietnam. 1990, however, presented the recently reunified Germany with a shifting post-colonial landscape, especially in Africa. 1990, the year that Germany was unified, was also the year that Namibia achieved independence from South Africa, which allowed for direct German-Namibian relations for the very first time. Multi-party elections were starting to take place throughout Africa in the early 1990s, including in many countries that had once been, either in part or in whole, part of the German Empire. It included today's Tanzania, Togo, Cameroon, and Nigeria, which included parts of German colonial Cameroon. At the same time, Rwanda and Burundi, which had also been in part of the larger German East African region, fell into inter-ethnic conflict, leading famously and tragically to the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Together with the genocide happening in Bosnia in the mid-1990s, the topic of genocide was being brought to the fore and into the daily news in a way that it had not been. And it was part and parcel of German discussions at the time about what it means to be normal, what it means to be responsible, how to think about genocide, what to do in the case of genocides happening today. In other words, never again was suddenly no longer an abstract concept, but the question was being raised quite specifically. If we argue that genocide is happening in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in other places, what does that mean for the state and for the citizens? So it was against this background of newly active democratic politics in Africa and the genocides in Rwanda and in Bosnia, in which descendants of German colonial atrocities, the Herero and the Nama tribes, the descendants of the Herero and the Nama genocide of 1904 to 1908, and those of the Maji Maji massacre in East Africa, which took place between 1905 and 1907. This was the context in which these descendants began to formulate charges of genocide and war crimes and to seek recognition, apology, and compensation. These calls for these things started to really gain traction in the lead up to a very significant double anniversary in 2004. This was, on the one hand, the 100th anniversary of the start of the genocide against the Herero and the Nama, and it was also the 120th anniversary of the 1884 Berlin Africa Conference, sometimes known as the Congo Conference, in which the European powers divided up Africa at the invitation of Otto von Bismarck. These anniversaries in 2004 led to a watershed moment when the SPD development minister, Heidemarie Wittschek-Choil, gave a speech in Namibia declaring, quote, "We Germans recognize our historical, political, moral, and ethical responsibility and guilt." She saw this speech as a form of apology. It wasn't universally interpreted as a form of apology. In fact, newspaper accounts at the time recounted people yelling out in the audience, "Where is the apology?" And her statement opened up a debate, a heated debate about what apology means, what constitutes an apology, and perhaps even more important, what legal obligations does an apology imply? Who has the standing to negotiate or to litigate? Is it the descendants of the tribes? Is it the Namibian state? Is the German state today responsible for acts of an earlier German state? And it raised debates about how to interpret the large amount of development aid and reconciliation initiatives that had been going on. This debate, in turn, began to rekindle scholarly debate that had been going on for some time about the relationship between colonial genocide and the Holocaust. In this emerging situation, Germany started to see demands for the return of human remains emerging as a major issue. The Charité Hospital in Berlin put together a project called the Charité Human Remains Project that resulted in 2011 in a ceremony that was somewhat awkward and somewhat controversial due to protocol issues, among others, that ended up returning 20 skulls that had been taken from Namibia to Berlin back to Namibia. And this was followed by other ongoing repatriations, not only to Africa, also to Paraguay, to Australia, and then I think there were some more recently to Alaska and Japan about the Ainu population. And this continues to be one of the major axes of thinking about how to come to terms with the German-specific history of colonialism. Parallel to the demands for the return of human remains was the decision to move Berlin's ethnographic museums of Asian and African art and artifacts from Dahlem, where they had been, to the new Humboldt Forum, which I'm sure almost all of you are, or all of you are familiar with. The Humboldt Forum, which is a new cultural complex that's situated in the reconstructed Imperial Palace, which was blown up originally in 1950 by the East German Communist Party, and then turned into the Palace of the Republic, which in turn was torn down and has now been replaced by a replica of the Imperial Palace. So this move of Berlin's ethnographic museums of Asian and African art and artifacts into the replica of the former Imperial Palace propelled discussions about colonialism to the front of the national stage. It mattered very much in this larger context that the Humboldt Forum find a way to deal with mounting criticism that it was being at best insensitive and at worst replicating some of the attitudes from the colonial era, against which, of course, they argue very vociferously. These developments, the rise of the issues about the return of human remains, the large and complex debates about the movement of the ethnographic museums from Dahlem to the Humboldt Forum, led to a significant shift in the attitude of the German federal government and the museum world, due in large part to the actions of the culture minister, Monika Kluters, who prioritized issues of dealing with the colonial past at the ministerial level for the very first time. This led to some very concrete outcomes, such as a major revision of national museum guidelines dealing with questions of artifacts and art from colonial heritage. And it led to the creation of an explicitly colonial-focused unit, a colonial heritage unit within a national center called the German Center for Lost Cultural Art, the Deutsches Zentrum Kulturgutverluste, which had been formed originally to deal with Nazi-looted art, had expanded to deal to some extent with issues of heritage from former East Germany, and then only in the last year now has had a unit added to it to deal with colonial heritage explicitly. These shifts in the attitude of the German federal government and these steps were accompanied and pressured by an intensification of civil society activism and local municipal initiatives, for example, in Hamburg and other places, around the issues of colonial heritage and colonial memory more broadly. Local grassroots organizations in Germany that deal specifically with colonial issues have grown from a handful in the early 2000s to over 40 in 18 cities today, and that's probably an undercount. And they are instrumental in connecting issues of colonial memory to contemporary problems of racism and inequality. Very often they are known by names such as the name of the city and then the word post-colonial or anti-colonial, and they very explicitly mix together questions of contemporary racism, contemporary immigration issues, contemporary inequality to the questions of the colonial past. They are also very interested in trying to do historical work in their own communities to understand the legacies and the involvement in the colonial past. And in a way, their actions echo the tradition of the new social movements that we've seen in the 1970s and the 1980s in West Germany, particularly what's known as the history movement or the Geschichtsbewegung, and the history workshops, the Geschichtswerkstätten, with their famous motto, dig where you stand. Arguably, today's post-colonial, anti-colonial, and diaspora organizations are, like these movements before them, actively creating an alternative source of historical knowledge that is significantly influencing national memory culture. So this, told in a very abbreviated fashion, is the context in which a parliamentary debate took place last year on national efforts to work through, aufarbeiten, Germany's colonial heritage. And this debate was based on an inquiry from the Green Party. At one level, this debate, which took place in February of 2019, served as a kind of public assertion by all of the parties except the AfD of this demokratische Grundkonsens, this fundamental democratic consensus that I mentioned earlier from the coalition treaty, this consensus that confronting the colonial past, as one of the CDU speakers put it at the debate, entails a duty to repair injustice, Unrecht wiedergutmachen. At another level, this debate reflects the global context that I mentioned earlier, since in the last decade, other European countries have been making belated apologies. For example, Italy to Libya, the UK to Kenya for the Mau Mau, which also included financial compensation and it was really path-breaking in that respect. And most recently, Emmanuel Macron's speech in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, where he called for the return of African heritage to Africa. In this context, if part of Germany's self-understanding rests on being a kind of world champion in dealing with difficult pasts, the colonial appears as one area where Germany was relatively late in competing. At the same time, given the poor record of the other former colonial powers in making good on their apologies, this is also an area with opportunity for more consequential action if Germany was able to grasp the moment. So these were some of the issues that I think were playing behind the scenes as this debate unfolded in the parliament. A key question in the debate itself was thus whether Germany possessed some kind of comparative advantage due to its experience in dealing with the legacies of two very different dictatorships. The left-leaning parties, especially the Greens and Die Linke, the left party, explicitly in the debate presented colonial crimes in relation to these dictatorships, seeing them as part of German history exactly, genauso, is a quote, like the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes against humanity. And they stated explicitly that, quote, what was valid for the NS terror dictatorship is valid for German colonial crime. Consequently, the proposals that were coming primarily from the Greens and Die Linke, to some extent the SPD, these proposals that were presented for discussion drew strongly on the repertoire of practices used to confront the Nazi era. For example, to add colonialism into already existing education programs for youth that are already designed to teach about the Nazi and the SED past, creating a central memorial in Berlin for the victims of colonialism, renaming streets and places, and extending the so-called Washington Consensus, not Washington Consensus, extending the so-called Washington Principles that were developed in the 1990s about Nazi confiscated art to colonial objects. And these Washington Principles put the burden of proof on of legitimacy on the current owner rather than on the people bringing the charge. So these were all extensions of the kind of work that was already being done and just sort of adding colonialism to them. The center-right parties in the debate were less sanguine about this approach. They declined to approve these proposals, which have not been implemented in general. And they claimed that a one-to-one transfer was inappropriate from the Nazi era and the SED era to the colonial era. They preferred instead to argue that what was required is a scientifically based research approach, one that would come up with, quote, sensible decisions, unquote, about restitution. The problem of this approach for the SPD and for the other parties was that it kept what's known as interpretive control, Deutungshoheit, with the Germans. As one of the SPD speakers put it, Helge Lind, it's not our business whether restituted objects are stored in cellars or the garden or ingested in rituals or treated in whatever way. He announced in English, let's give up control. To which the AfD responded from their seats, by all means. Now the AfD, interestingly, was the only party who did not agree with the consensus that the colonial past must be dealt with, even if there was disagreement on precisely how. Rather, they turned the whole argument on its head and accused the call for the restitution of colonial heritage as being a nefarious plot to, and here I quote, lay the foundation for the acceptance of mass immigration migration and multiculturalism. And the AfD speaker accused decolonization discourses of, quote, using intellectual terrorism to achieve their goals, including emptying out German museums and implicitly threatening an imagined and idealized racial order of German society itself through mass immigration. So, in conclusion, I'd like to highlight three aspects that stand out from this debate. First is looking at the dominant discourses from all of the parties except the AfD. What's striking when you look at the text in detail is that the real consensus seems to be not just that the colonial past is important to deal with and confront as part of democratic responsibility, but that the memory of a colonial past is seen as something missing, some kind of a lack, a repressed chapter, empty pages. Very often, such as in the Antrag, in the inquiry from the Greens, it's presented through the illness metaphor of colonial amnesia that requires a cure, and that cure takes the shape of a fundamental enlargement, in their words, of memory culture to include colonialism. So that seems to be one of the main areas that had a large sense of agreement within this kind of debate. Now, this consensus around the memory of the colonial past as something missing brackets and really doesn't take into account the arguments that the colonizing discourses are trying to bring up. And it obscures voices that were not represented in the debate. These are represented often by the growing number of activists, academics, artists, and writers who form the landscape of civil society. For them, dealing with colonial memory is not about determining the quote unquote proper way to remember the missing past, but rather to acknowledge that the so-called amnesia that Germany suffers from masks an active form of what one author called disremembering, or Erinnerung, new neologism there, Erinnerung, disremembering. Disremembering is presented, this is Nicola Loré al-Samarai, as a form of remembering and forgetting at the same time, with the effect that the subject of remembering, here the colonial subject in its double meaning, becomes reinscribed into ongoing forms of racism and exclusion. So the argument from the decolonization approach, which is bracketed by this consensus, is that if colonialism in its many forms is an ongoing structural condition rather than a long ago event to be remembered, then creating a memorial or changing street names, while necessary, appear more like small concessions which are insufficient, as Lilia Yousefi has pointed out, small concessions that are insufficient for changing long entrenched thought processes and power structures. The implication here is that if dealing with a colonial past is not just another case of doing what Germany already does well, it has the potential to fundamentally challenge the existing models of coming to terms with the past, reshaping wider moral landscapes around confrontations with difficult pasts. I think this is one of the reasons why, for very different reasons, the different parties respond with some unease to the implications around this more direct decolonial approach. The AfD, and this is the third aspect I wanted to highlight from the debate, the AfD, in their view, that restituting colonial heritage is a plot to increase migration and undermine German society, is in fact a case in point for the critics who seek to draw direct structural continuities between colonial legacies and thinking and today's volatile debates about migration, refugees, nationalism, xenophobia, Black lives, and populist politics. The AfD thus unwittingly indicates the future-oriented stakes of confronting the colonial past in the present, because reckoning, after all, is not about looking backwards, but about what we aspire to in the future. To conclude then, this linking of the colonial past with the travails of today gets to the heart of discussions about what it means to be German, what it means to live in a diverse society, and how attitudes towards the other will impact the future of the country. 35% of Germans are likely to have a migration background in 20 years. And a report last fall by the German Federal Institute for Employment Research, the IAB, projected that Germany will require about 400,000 immigrants per year until 2060 to avoid the economy shrinking. COVID-19 may delay these trends, but it's unlikely to reverse them. If, as the 2018 coalition agreement proclaims, without remembrance there is no future, ohne Erinnerung keine Zukunft, then the future depends very much on how colonial memory, in Germany as elsewhere, becomes part of today's memory cultures. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, if participants would like to pose questions in the Q&A box, I will curate them. But maybe while everybody gets started with that, I'll pose a question myself. Well, actually, I have many questions, but I couldn't help but think that just today in the Spiegel, there was an interesting article about Robert Koch, right, from the Koch Institute, and how he was apparently involved in some pretty heinous experiments on indigenous people when he was in Africa a couple of times. So this author was advocating that Germany think about changing the name of the Koch Institute, which has obviously been very much in the news lately. And I couldn't help but think that that was very reminiscent of the debates that we've had throughout the United States about renaming schools, renaming streets, and things like that, so that the Confederate individuals are no longer honored in that manner. So, Jonathan, I'm just wondering, do you think that something like this is going to get some traction in German politics, this kind of like renaming movement, also as a gesture to try to reconcile and make amends for the past? Because I'm sure that once you scratch the surface, there's a lot more that one might think about renaming in the German context.
Thank you, Eric. Certainly renaming is one of the big issues, and it's also one of the ones that gets a lot of attention when it's written about, because it elicits a lot of strong feelings of different kinds. We know that very well here in the United States. And it is also something which can very easily exceed the boundaries of the specific case at hand. In Germany, certainly renaming has been one of the demands consistently from many activists. The areas where renaming has had the most impact so far has been in Wedding in Berlin, in the so-called Afrikanisches Viertel, in the African Quarter, and also in regard to military barracks that have been named after generals and others that have been involved in colonial era atrocities. So there are examples where renaming has happened in Germany. There are certainly ongoing cases where renaming is not complete and is still highly contested. For example, in Berlin, the so-called Mohrenstraße in Mitte is an ongoing and continuous source of controversy with many, many demands to rename that street. And the debates there, I think, similar to the United States, play an important role in bringing these issues into the public eye and making issues visible. Whether or not in every single case they are successful, it still manages to raise all kinds of interesting debates, which otherwise had become kind of invisible, in the sense that statues, street names, names of squares, as Robert Musil has famously said about monuments, they tend to become invisible, right? We don't see them anymore. And so this claim, this call to rename is one way of bringing back into visibility some of these legacies. And in that sense, I think it can have an extremely positive impact on the general discussion. As to the Robert Koch Institute, whether that will be renamed, I don't know how that will play out. I think it will certainly become part of the larger question of how do we think about what it means to deal with the very ambiguous legacy of the colonial past. And I think it's related but not identical to Confederate monuments. It's more similar perhaps to Marion Sims, I should say, who is known as the father of gynecology in the United States, and who practiced and perfected his techniques on African women without anesthesia and without their consent, who had been slaves. And the question of how do you deal with the legacy of somebody who played an important role in the history of medicine, also engaged in really atrocious atrocities while doing it.
All right, we have a lot of really great questions here. I might take them a little out of order. Here's one about the centrality of Christian missions to German colonialism. And so what is the role of churches in this more recent work of memory in Germany?
The role of churches, that's a very good question, actually. Interestingly, reflecting on that now, I can't say that the role of churches is as prominent as I might have expected in looking across the array of civil society organizations and what they write about and what they talk about. I think that there is a great role for the churches to play, especially since a very large part of the colonial enterprise did consist of attempts to recruit and to expand the church into the colonial era areas. So I think one of the areas which has not yet really become a focus in the larger public eye is indeed this question of the role of the churches and the relationship to the government, the military, and the civil society at that time. That's a really important area, and there's a lot of work left to be done in the role of the churches. Certainly within the churches, this has been an issue. A lot of churches individually have established all kinds of activities with the former colonial spaces. They do have a lot of one-to-one contacts, but it's an area which requires a lot more working through.
All right, next, besides Monica Grütters, who are some of the key memory activists in calling to remember and grapple with this particular past? And then secondly, are there any differences between Easterners and Westerners on their view of colonialism?
That's a very good question. I mean, Monica Grütters is, of course, very visible. Michelle Munterfering is also someone that she's worked with on this. So there are particular individuals within the government and within each individual party that have spoken up very strongly and explicitly. However, the cast of characters is very wide. So it's very hard, I could name particular names of individuals, but I think that what you see is that you see memory activists mostly outside the government, moving into occasionally some of the government realms. But I would identify as the important actors people who fall into the following categories. I think some of the most important actors have been the groups that have started to form around the question of the human remains. So the Charité Human Remains Project, for example, Holger Stucker, who was leading that, and others who have brought this question not just to the public eye within Germany, have not just strove to find ways to work with and give a real chance to work with their counterparts in the so-called source countries, but also connect it to a transnational issue and an international issue. Similarly, those people who are involved with the questions about colonial heritage in museums, that's very significant. Some people like Sharon McDonald at the Humboldt University, for example, and where there's a center on the anthropological research into heritage and museums. Researchers associated with that have played a very significant role, I think especially Larissa Förster. And they've also really managed to bridge this divide between museum work, civil society activists, governments, and organizations such as the Stiftung Preußische Kulturbesitz. Of course, the people in the Humboldt Forum and the people in the museum world play very active roles in this. And then lastly, I would say that the really important actors in this are the leaders of the civil society groups. So I think here of some of the more established ones, Berlin Postkolonial, for example, some of the groups in Hamburg, Freiburg Postkolonial. Many of the leaders of these particular groups have been working on this for quite some period of time, and they are able to play a kind of a Schlüssel role, be able to play a kind of a key role that brings together activists, universities, municipal governments, and I think it's very important that that these civil society organizations cultivate these particular kinds of individuals who are able to work across these different domains and therefore make this a conversation rather than accusations. So the second question about East and West is of course a really important question and unavoidable. There's certainly the well-known difference that during the GDR era, the GDR presented itself as a champion of anti-colonialism, and this was to some extent certainly an instrumental approach, but I think there's also an undeniable aspect to which this was taken to heart by many of the people. I think in Susan Nyman's recent book, she shows at length how this was not simply superficial, but that many people within the East German establishment also believed quite sincerely. But at the same time, that this often played out in contradictory ways that didn't necessarily really live up to the rhetoric. So in former East Germany today, I think there is some of the same kind of resistances to wanting to be seen as adopting and adapting to a more West German inspired approach to thinking through different kinds of issues. So there's some tension around this question in general of how to deal with memory and how to deal with the colonial past. But you do see very much in cities such as Leipzig, where there's a major colonial collection, in Dresden, in Halle, the rise of civil society organizations that are devoted to the colonial past. So in one way, it's conceivable that the colonial past could be one of the spaces where East and West could start thinking about the past as a shared past in a way which might provide opportunities to move away from thinking about this as a divide and thinking about it more as a common goal for thinking about the current era. Of course, it's flavored by the presence of the right wing, which is not exclusive by any means to the former East Germany and the new Bundesländer, but is obviously particularly strong, especially in Saxony, as you mentioned before, and through the influence of the AfD. So to the extent to which the AfD is successful in linking these questions of colonial restitution and colonial memory to questions of mass migration and multiculturalism, which is the flip side of the way in which the civil society organizations are in fact trying to link those as well, but for the very different purpose. I think you will see a breakdown along some of the kind of political divides that we already see where there will be less willingness to embrace confronting the colonial past among people who are more influenced by the off days version of contemporary events.
All right, we're getting a lot of really good questions, so I'm going to try to combine them as much as I can. One question is about how the discourse in Germany about colonial memory seems to be inspired by a lot of the arguments and discussions that have been taking place in North America, particularly by indigenous scholars. So do you think that these newer ideas kind of imported from the United States and elsewhere, so to say, can help to kind of loosen up German memory discourses more generally? And then related to that, do you start to see some standardization here, some globalization of colonial memory? And is this kind of similar to the globalization of Holocaust memory that Levy and Schneider wrote about many years ago?
Those are really excellent questions, both of them. Yes, I think there's definitely an influence in especially the civil society realm, but also in the museum realm, and the question of restitution more broadly from the United States and other countries as well. Absolutely, the questions and the context that has been generated by Black Lives Matter has been very influential. There are German chapters of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is also connected to these larger questions, which feed into how to deal with the legacies of colonialism today, racism and injustice, and the questions of indigenous populations in the United States and the different kind of memory issues that come up there are relevant in Germany. I think one of the interesting ways in which this has entered the German memory discourse is through some recent work in indigenous studies that has spoken about the role of German settlers in the United States and North America more broadly, Canada, today's Canada and the United States, and the role that the German settlers played in settler colonialism, which connects to a larger question about what does colonialism mean when you talk about it in the German context. In other words, are we speaking only about the period of formal colonies from the 1880s to the end of the First World War, or are we also speaking about all the different ways in which people from Germany were involved in the project of settler colonialism? And so this question of how to think about German settlers does connect very directly to questions about indigeneity and indigenous responses. Even though Germany itself is not considered a settler colony, there were Germans who were involved in settler colonial enterprises beyond their formal colonies and prior to their formal colonies. So that's a very rich area where there is a lot of cross-reference and cross influence. That gets to the second question about a global colonial memory discourse. That's a really big question of the moment. I think you can argue that you can see something like a global colonial memory discourse emerging, but I don't think that you can argue that it has the same kind of status that Levy and Schneider pointed out in their book about the global Holocaust memory discourse. I think what you are seeing is you're seeing an awareness in the former imperial countries that they have to confront their pasts in a transnational global context. In other words, the national frame, the national context for thinking about their past, including the colonial past, is insufficient. And the strength of being able to confront is to be able to think about it in a system-wide level. The risk there, of course, is always that there's a temptation to try to give up, to abdicate some responsibility into a wider system level. So there's this very important balance that needs to be struck between accountability and responsibility for the specific actions of the specific countries and states and nations, at the same time as a recognition that what these countries and nations were involved in was a transnational and global process. And I think that you do see an increasing amount of sharing among the different activist groups that are pushing and learning from each other. However, this learning from each other is limited to a significant extent so far due to language differences, due to to an incomplete sort of memory infrastructure, if you will, that allows for the kind of transference of knowledge and ideas, which is emerging but still has a ways to go.
Okay, so turning to the Humboldt Forum for a second, there have been quite a few debates and discussions, as you mentioned, but what changes or adjustments have the curators made in response to a lot of these criticisms and this more general discourse?
I mean, certainly there have been responses from the Humboldt Forum that involve specific changes to exhibits. And I think that a large part of the changes, the Humboldt Forum hasn't opened yet. It's supposed to open by now. It's supposed to open this coming fall, and now it seems like it is delayed again. But I think that the most important changes are less about a specific object per se, although there are certain objects which are particularly controversial and well-known, but is about the way in which the exhibits are made. So the question of how to involve participants from the countries where the artifacts or the art is from, how to involve people from Cameroon in the presentation of an exhibit with artifacts from Cameroon. So I think the Humboldt Forum has tried very hard to involve people from the so-called quote-unquote source countries. They've tried very hard to think about how to acknowledge and the difficult questions. And I think they thought very hard about how to do provenance research. And provenance research is really the key issue for the Humboldt Forum, because provenance research is about this question: were the objects legitimately acquired or legally acquired? If not, should they be restored? Can they be restituted? Under what conditions and how? And this really is the sort of the centerpiece of the Humboldt Forum's position, which is to have a pragmatic and measured approach to provenance research, because they feel that the vast majority of their collections were in fact acquired legally and legitimately. Now, the issue with this that the critics have is not that objects should not be returned and that there shouldn't be any provenance research. The issue that the critics have is that to a certain extent, the museum is missing the point, and that it's not the objects themselves that are the focus of critical inquiry. It's the museum itself that is the focus of critical inquiry. As one scholar from South Africa, Siraj Rasool, has put it, provenance research is not an empirical project, it's a critical project. Because whether some objects were, by any given standard, legitimately acquired or not, is kind of beside the point, because a lot of the critics point out that the debt incurred by colonialism fundamentally is not something that can be repaid or made good by returning an object, as complicated as that particular process is. This doesn't mean that reckoning is futile, but it means that it's part and parcel of what decolonization is calling for, which is more than whether an object is displayed in one way or another, or shared in one way or another, or returned. And this was the heart of a very influential report by Paulina Azar and Benedict Savoy on the restitution of African art from Europe, specifically France, to Africa, which called for a new relational ethics. And I think this question about, are we talking about a pragmatics of provenance research? Are we talking about a new relational ethics? And how do we bring these two things together is one of the areas where there's been a lot of progress, but there's still also some talking past each other between the museum and some of its critics.
I think we have time for one question, maybe two, but there's actually several questions here about the role of monetary compensation and how that relates to a reluctance of governments to apologize. I'm also wondering if there's any kind of coordination or at least discussion amongst former colonial powers about holding the line. I could imagine if the Germans negotiated something that would then perhaps create some pressure for the Brits, the French, the Belgians, the Portuguese to also engage in such compensation. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the UK agreement about the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, which did include monetary compensation, was exactly a potential precedent in the way that you're talking about. I think it would be going too far to say that the colonial powers are colluding to explicitly to avoid that precedent, but certainly there is considerable concern among the European former colonial powers that they want to be reasonably clear about what the boundaries are of compensation. It's a very touchy issue. Compensation and apology, well, the question, as I mentioned before during the talk, is that when you talk about apology, what does that imply? Can you apologize and not have an implication that therefore is enabling certain types of claims, and those kind of claims could include claims for compensation and reparations? These questions are indeed at the heart of a lot of the discussions around colonialism and slavery in the United States. I think that they're essential questions, which are really more at the beginning in terms of what would it mean to compensate and to repair. And up until now, certainly in the German case, there has not been any willingness really on the side of the federal government to provide monetary compensation explicitly to the descendants of German atrocities from the colonial era. They've been very explicit about that, pretty much following the motto, we're willing to apologize, but that doesn't include compensation. The argument for that is multiple, but of course part of the argument is that the current federal republic does not have the legal responsibility for those atrocities. The question, the way in which and this is an interesting part to getting at your larger point, the way in which some of these compensation issues do in compensation in the Herrera-Nama case is to follow a page taken from Holocaust reparations in terms of questions of suing the German government in courts outside of German jurisdiction. So there have been groups from the Herero who have been suing the German government in the United States District Court here in New York City. They could use Bach and other kinds of acts in order to force the German government to pay reparations, similar to the way in which Swiss banks have been forced through courts in the United States in the Federal District of New York to pay compensation. In that sense, they really are learning from each other and looking at these different models.
All right, well, that brings us right to 2 o'clock, which is our allotted time. I have several other questions that we couldn't get to, Jonathan, but I will send them to you for your own purposes. But on behalf of AICGS and all the participants, I really want to thank you for such a rigorous, for such a stimulating and such an important talk today. So hopefully we can continue this dialogue in the future.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to speak with all of you. Thank you for tuning in.
All right,
Thanks,
goodbye,
Jonathan.
everyone.